So this is a paper, and this is something that we've talked about in the group, kind of going way back to the things we were doing when we started doing Neuromatch, and they had talks from different people, and they had Stephen Grossberg. So Stephen Grossberg is known for adaptive resonance theory. So what he's doing in this paper here will be important in the formation of adaptive resonance theory. And as you can see, this is an unsupervised learning model that consists of a comparison field and a recognition field composed of neurons, a vigilance parameter, a threshold of recognition, and a reset module. So it is basically taking the biology of the visual system and the attentional system and merging it into this sort of neural network type structure. So he's computationalizing a lot of this in a connectionist structure, what we would call connectionism, but would later figure prominently in the development of neural networks. I always like to look back in time in terms of AI and see what people were doing way back when, because I think it's informative and instructive for what can be, what's possible, and kind of the roots of what we are doing now. So this is Stephen Grossberg from 1976. So this is on the development of feature detectors in the visual cortex with applications to learning and reaction-diffusion systems. So it's worth thinking about the history of AI, where there are things that were going on very early that were, the attempt was to mimic biological intelligence, however that is. So if you go back to McCullough and Pitts, they were trying to build a biophysical model of neurons. And that's actually kind of what they proposed in their original papers. And so that was something that was the basis for the perceptron, which came later. And the perceptron is the idea that you have this machine that does perception. And it's always this metaphor followed up by some abstraction of the biological system. And of course, we lose in that abstraction, we lose detail, and we lose the things that maybe make that thing quote unquote biological. We lose the complexity to do things that are computationally tractable. So we want to model, say for example, a simple perceptual system, or we want to model some neurons and their connections, or we want to model feature detection and surround inhibition, things like that. We use some sort of computational abstraction and we lose detail, but we keep the metaphor and say this is learning. Because it actually does learn things, it has this sort of loose connection with biology. And it's worth thinking about because we do this again and again in the history of AI. And not to give a preview of what I'm going to talk about at embodied intelligence, but this is one thing that we've never really resolved from the early years of AI. It's kind of like this thing that's stuck around with us. And the question is, will we ever kind of get past that and maybe to actual sort of biophysical machines? And the answer is, people have proposed that actually, and it never really went anywhere. We might be able to get there with things like organoids, like we've talked about, but still, it's maybe far off and maybe will never happen. So this is actually a paper that is, kind of the basis for a lot of the stuff he would do with neural networks later. So that's just giving some context here. So the abstract reads, developmental mechanisms for tuning the visual cortex. So his interest actually is in development, not in neural networks, in biological development. And he's interested in the development of the brain specifically. And so this is where we have the tuning of visual cortex. And this is, of course, where in development, if we're looking at the mammalian brain, we have a visual system that's starting to form. We have eyes that are opening up to the world, taking in light, and it's wired to this, set of cortical structures that need to be shaped by those stimuli. And of course, we can look at the neuroscience literature to see what happens when you have blind mammals that are, we have blind mammals. What they'll do is in an experiment that will nucleate the embryo, they'll take out the eyes, and then they'll just kind of it's like a rat or something, and then they'll let it live, into development, and then look at the brain structures, and they're very different from the brain structures of animals that develop a visual system and actually experience perception, visual perception. So, this is something that is interesting from a learning perspective because it suggests that while there are some things that are innate, there's a lot of stuff that's acquired from the environment, a lot of stuff that's shaped by learning. So, he's talking about this tuning of visual cortex, where visual cortex, the connectivity and the sensitivity of the cells and the regions are tuned by environmental mechanisms that are experienced in development. And so he's talking about this tuning, this adaptation, and that it's actually derived from adult learning mechanisms. So this is all defined as an adaptational property of shunting on-center, off-surround networks that prevents saturation of parallel processed patterns at high input intensities, a contrast enhancement in short-term memory mechanism, and plastic synaptic strengths that compute a time average of presynaptic signals and postsynaptic activities and multiplicatively gate signals. The mechanisms can generate fields of feature detectors, which are line or picture detectors. So if you're familiar with attention mechanisms, you know that people focus on this very thing, where you have this feature detection and you focus on the features and you ignore other things in the image. This is kind of where this comes from. And actually, this is where biological attention comes from, is this idea that, you're doing early feature detection in the visual system. And that's sort of setting up your ability to attend to certain things in a scene versus not attend to certain things in a scene. A developing hierarchy of such fields can be synthesized in which successive critical developmental periods are triggered as a dynamic equilibrium. As a dynamic equilibrium is established between short-term memory and long-term memory at each stage. So he gets into this critical periods work, this critical developmental periods work, and it kind of gives you this sort of way of approaching development and way of approaching developmental sensitivities and developmental tuning. So critical periods are these short windows in development where a lot of these sort of the most important things are acquired. So a lot of times in development we have structures that start to form and they exhibit plasticity at a certain point in time, like maybe a couple days of development. And if things don't happen during that couple of days of development, they won't ever happen. So you can have, no exposure to the environment over those several days, and it can result in long-term deficits to the organism. Or you can have enhanced, enriched experience during those few days, and it can result in a positive thing for the organism. And you can use these critical periods to sort of look at how how contingent development is. In other words, if something happens during the critical period, it's acquired. If it doesn't, it's not acquired. And that sets up the sort of the complexity of the brain afterwards. So it's a really interesting tool to use to look at, artificial intelligence. Then shunting adaptation can account for some data on spatial frequency adaptation. Shunting network properties resemble properties of certain reaction-diffusion systems that have been used to model developmental data in various species, such as Hydra, Xenopus retina, slime molds, and others. So this is where they're looking at these, they're looking at reaction-diffusion systems in development, or they're looking at reaction-diffusion systems, and they're looking at how those operate through the dynamics, and they're using it to model developmental data in these different systems where they're looking at um, adaptation and perception. So reaction diffusion systems are systems where you have maybe like a bunch of molecules in a chamber, and you're looking at how they respond, like different chemicals respond to pure diffusion processes. That means where they expand outward from a central source. So a lot of times you'll have chemical systems where you have diffusion of a chemical signal or a chemical set of molecules from a source. And if you have a bunch of these operating in an environment, those sources will sort of have this area of influence or this gradient that expands outward, and then those gradients intersect and start to form boundaries. So this is actually a nice system for looking at pattern recognition, because you can model reaction diffusion as a system of patterns that form from sort of randomness or from, this sort of self-organizational property. And of course, back then the language wasn't quite the same as what we're using later. So this is, we use reaction diffusion now, but thinking about this sort of, these aspects of cognition and these aspects of artificial intelligence the terminology wasn't there yet. So, for example, positional information due to regulation and reaction diffusion systems is analogous to constancies due to network adaptation. Firing of a developmental gradient is analogous to contrast enhancement, and maintenance of a pattern in morphogens is analogous to short-term memory. So if you're not familiar with developmental biology, this is a lot of jargon, but what it basically means is he's taking components of developmental systems and he's using this as an analogy for cognition. So you have this pattern that is a pattern of these molecules that's analogous to a store in short-term memory. There's a developmental gradient or the firing of a developmental gradient is analogous to contrast enhancement in the visual system. And then this positional information, which is where cells know kind of where they need to be on an anatomical axis in embryogenesis when an embryo is forming. And this also shows up in reaction diffusion systems, is analogous to these network adaptation mechanisms. So very interesting stuff. And he cites a lot of this early computational neuroscience literature. So he says 2 recent theoretical papers, and remember this is in 1975, so 1973, 1974 era. 2 recent theoretical papers discuss the development of specificity in primate visual cortex. Both papers use analogous mechanisms that derive their results. One of these mechanisms, which is plasticity of cross-correlational synapses, has been mathematically proved capable of learning arbitrary acts in a wide variety of circumstances. A second mechanism, which is on-center off-surround anatomy, is believed to exist in the adult sensory processing areas such as retina and neocortex. And this is in mammals. A third mechanism, attenuation of small signals in a recurrent network, has been shown to be necessary to prevent amplification of noise in networks capable of short-term memory. And then a fourth mechanism, conservation of total synaptic strength at each cell, can be replaced as an adaptational property of on-center, off-surround networks undergoing shunting interactions. So this paper argues that the formal mechanisms which have been suggested for the development of specificity are also mechanisms that are needed for efficient learning in the mature organism. So this is where you have this analogy between what's going on in development, what's going on in terms of how development takes us from this undifferentiated set of cells to organs and to structures and to other types of things that are highly asymmetrical and highly specialized, specificity, to sort of the same mechanisms that are used in learning and efficient learning. And so learning, of course, is the encoding of information the acquisition and retention of information and the recall of information as memory. And learning, of course, is important in neural networks. He's not talking about that so much here, but this is something that is going to become relevant later on when he starts to work with neural networks and these other things that he's going to be doing later. So, and so this is where he cites Weisel and Hubel, where they demonstrate that abnormal early visual experiences can induce abnormal development of afferent connections of visual cortex. In other words, if you don't have that early visual experience, you don't have the circuitry for later visual performance, visual perception, and that affects the rest of the organism's life. So that early experience sets the gain for later on in development and in adulthood. And so this is kind of what we see with learning. If you don't acquire things in training, you can't make good predictions and so forth. And then they kind of talk about these other types of analogies between development and learning and how those things are related, and looking really at the structure of these different types of systems in biology and then abstracting that to computation. Not quite at computation yet in this paper, but he's starting to do some of this stuff where he's just drawing diagrams. This is reminiscent of what Breitenberg was doing in his Cybernetics, where he was drawing diagrams of circuits, and then that would later become sort of computationalized as this sort of as you could build an artificial system with them. And then this kind of goes through some of this other work. He gives a review of developmental network models, and so this is just kind of going over some of these models. This is looking at cortex and the orientation of cells in cortex. So one of the things that happens in development in the visual cortex is the cells become tuned to stimuli, and so this is where they're kind of looking at the neurophysiology here, where they're looking at the tuning of these cells to when the organism is orienting itself to a visual signal. And this is where they're teaching the visual system through experience how to acquire this sort of tuning. So you can see here the view onto cortex after 100 steps of learning. It's figure 3, where you see these patterns of orientation that are sort of forming order as opposed to being completely random. If you had an organism without eyes, you would try to do 100 steps of learning, or if it didn't have eyes during its critical period, but then it had the ability to acquire visual stimuli, this array after 100 steps of learning would be totally random. That's the idea. So these developmental mechanisms kind of map to learning and how things are learned, because development has, in organisms, development is sort of a precursor to learning. B, it uses similar cellular and molecular mechanisms, which isn't cited here, but this is something that we find out later in the 80s and 90s especially. And then C, we can use this metaphor for kind of neural networks and AI, but this is something where we had mastered the learning or gotten really good at the learning, but not necessarily at the development. So we have machines that can learn, but then development is still this thing that's like we're trying to do, and it's hard to kind of bootstrap learning from nothing. It's kind of like easy to build a machine that learns, like a neural network that acquires information and encodes it in these memory structures, but it's hard to sort of get something to form, sort of self-organize into a memory. And then do you rely heavily on innate features, or do you rely heavily on environmental features? That's where I think the problem is with the sort of developmental AI, is that we don't have that mix in a way that can give us good results. So this is just kind of going through some of the visual perception work, and he talks about recurrent networks and contrast enhancement, short-term memory, and looking at recurrent onset or off-surround interactions, and other things like that. And then he talks about developmental hierarchies and critical periods here. So another important property of the model is it can be used to generate a hierarchy of selectively tuned networks. This is like in visual cortices 17, 18, and 19, where there exist cells exhibiting ever more selective response criteria. So this is a hierarchical property that follows from the fact that the cortex in our model also adapts to its total activity, as section 5 describes. Hence, the cortex can be used as the retina for a second stage in the hierarchy. Its outputs will be the inputs in the next cortical structure, and its axons will also possess cross-correlational synapses. A central problem for such a model is, how are the critical periods of developmental plasticity and successive anatomical levels regulated so that the coded meaning of outputs from one stage to the next does not change from moment to moment? So in other words, how do you keep this plasticity? How do you lock in the adaptive results of this plasticity? If you have a plasticity mechanism, things could just drift continually and end up at a place that's not optimized, or not even something that's learned. So you could just keep adapting or changing constantly and never lock in on the solution. And so that's what he's talking about here. Why is it that biological systems lock in on that solution and not just kind of change until a certain point and then stop, and then you end up with something that actually doesn't learn anything? So and it goes through this whole idea of critical periods and other types of things. And this is something that is interesting because this is something he's talking about in 1975. And he later goes on to do stuff with neural networks and all these other things and cognitive science. And as far as I know, this has never really been definitively solved. So this is kind of a thing that you bring up, and then it's like a challenge, and it's hard to kind of define how to implement this computationally or computationalize it. And then eventually we end up with, he did a lot of great work in his career, but it's like, we still have things that are outstanding from this. So it's really kind of unlocking this huge problem space that we are still working on today. Okay, so that was the Grossberg paper. Okay, so this is, DevAI, hashtag. Ever more selective response criterion, section 6. How are critical periods of development regulated? Yeah.
Those are, I'll have to go back. Could you list the or mention the title of the paper again? Because I don't know. I want to look at that for other things.
Yeah.
So.
This is on the development of feature detectors in the visual cortex with applications to learning and reaction-diffusion systems.
All right, thank you.
And if you're, I don't know what your library access is, but this is a deep cut, as they say. So we talked about this idea in Cognition Futures a couple years ago. This came up a lot. And I know Hussein is kind of interested in this, and this was also something that we talked about with Amanda and in the Cognition Futures group. This is a paper where there's this thing called the Bouba-Kiki effect. And it's where you present different shapes. You have like a shape that doesn't really have a name. Like it's an abstract shape. It's made of a complex geometric structure. No one's really been able to categorize because they've created this made up thing. It's like a spiky little ball or something, And people will give names to those objects based on their sort of shape and their visual properties. So Bouba is like something that's rounded and soft, and then Kiki is something that's spiky and sharp. And this is a cross-modal association, like we're talking about. So that means that if you see some object that has a certain look to it, you make a certain noise that describes it, and it sounds like what it looks like. You could also describe different sounds by their sharpness or softness in the same way. We'll describe sounds in ways that we'll have like shortcuts to naming things that are kind of, we've never heard it before. We describe it. It sounds like and then you might say it's a Kiki sound or a Booba sound or something like that. And those aren't like language. Those aren't words that we've used in language. I mean, they're not formal descriptions, but they're names that we ascribe to something that doesn't really have a name, and we just kind of describe it as, well, it's an interesting cognitive kind of curiosity. And so what's interesting is that people thought that this was something humans did because we had language, spoken, spoken language, and that was hallmark of human cognition. In this paper, what they're saying is that naive baby chicks, in other words, baby chicks, in a developmental stage, acquiring information, do something similar. So yeah, this is matching sounds to shapes, evidence of the Bouba-Kiki effect in naive baby chicks. And so the abstract here is, if you hear the non-words Kiki and Boba, you may be more likely to associate them with a spiky and round object, respectively, rather than the opposite. So Kiki is spiky, Boba is round, and it's just like kind of attaching a sound to what a shape might look like. Boba being round, Kiki being spiky. You might have like a waveform in your mind when you look at the object, and you might use that waveform to form the sound or something. This is a case of sound symbolism known as the Bouba-Kiki effect. Studies on 4-month infants suggest that this effect might constitute a predisposed perceptual mechanism. So this is in humans where they've looked at infants that do this, and they have this. So the idea is that it's some sort of innate effect that is innate to our perception as humans, and that it's something that we do early in development, but it is something that is also gives us like a tool to deal with information we've never seen before. However, these studies suffered from the impossibility of ruling out a fast experience-driven origin of the effect, resulting from infant speed of learning, their sensitivity to environmental regularities, and the large number of sound symbolic associations to which they are precociously exposed to when interacting with adults. In other words, it's very hard to do these developmental experiments. Are the babies simply just copying what adults are doing, and what the adults are doing has been learned from somewhere else? Or are they just kind of integrating information from the larger world and then kind of inferencing from that? We don't really know. It's hard to do these kind of developmental experiments where you isolate something to an innate effect. So to better describe its ontogeny and fill in this gap, and ontogeny just means its developmental course, we tested the Bouba-Kiki effect in domesticated chicks and Gallus. So these are chickens. Being a precocial species, chicks can be tested on the very early days of life, allowing for virtually total control of the experience before the test. So this is where you know that they haven't been exposed to anything in the world. Everything that they're doing is going to be somewhat, at least mostly, innate. And that's, kind of the idea in these kinds of experiments. 3-day-old chicks, 42 of them, first learned to circumnavigate a panel to obtain a food reward. Then they were presented with 2 identical panels, one depicting a spiky shape and one depicting a round shape. And then they hear the sound of Booba or Kiki. All right. So they hear the sound, they see the shape, they're integrating those 2 modalities. We recorded which panel chicks chose with either sound, so they peck at the thing that they've chosen in a total of 24 trials. Chicks prefer the panel with the spiky shape when hearing the Kiki sound, and that with the round shape when hearing the Booba sound. So we can assume that they're making the same kind of judgment or using the same kind of mechanism that human infants do. Results from naive baby chicks hinted a predisposed mechanism for matching the two dimensions of shape and sound that may be widespread across species. We talked about this with, there are a lot of multimodal models of artificial intelligence, a lot of multimodal models where you're training a model with two different modalities. And this is important in large language models because large language models, we're using language, we're building models of language. We also have images that we can attach to those linguistic tokens. We can attach labels to images, and we can use that as kind of a multimodal learning system. So it's important to kind of think about what is possible, what's learned, and maybe what we can hard code into these models, and what we maybe need to hard code that can't necessarily be learned from data directly. Okay, so this is just kind of goes over this history. This goes back to 1947, where they would invent these non-words that were kind of descriptions of a shape. You might look at the shape and look at the waveform of the shape, and then look at the waveform of a sound and make that connection. So maybe in the brains of these chicks or these humans, they're making this assessment of the waveform at both, and if it's similar, then there's a cross-modal fusion there. So there's a lot of work on cross-modal attention, cross-modal perception, where there's this idea that percepts fuse together for vision, for auditory stimuli. And when they're not fused together, when you don't have the visual information and the auditory information, say, the percept is weaker. So in other words, it's better that you have both modalities because there's a stronger response in different areas of the brain that enhance learning, that enhance memory, and that enhance sort of recognition later. So this is kind of the what they go through on this. And so basically, they have made this quite an interesting finding. And people originally thought that this was something limited to humans, and we find that this isn't necessarily the case. It might be a controversial experiment. You might argue with the methodology. You might argue that they're two different things. That maybe they're just kind of responding to there may be two different mechanisms involved. But this is something that, again, it's interesting. So the discussion talks about how the present study tested baby naive domestic chickens for an example of sound symbolism, namely the Bouba-Kiki effect, and they want to understand the ontogenetic origin of this effect. In fact, even if this is a strong and well-tested effect in our species, in both adults and infants, there is still an active debate on how it originates. We report a spontaneous tendency to match a round and spiky shape to the Bouba and Kiki sounds respectively in 3-day-old chicks. Our results fit into the current debate suggesting that sound symbolism belongs to a set of predisposed associations built into different species. Our data well support the existence of an early available mechanism as we hatched the eggs in the lab, where we exerted a virtually full control of the chick's experience, overcoming one of the biggest limitations from studies on human infants. Even though our subjects had never experienced a sound symbolic matching prior to test, they still spontaneously associated the two dimensions of shape and sound. This indicates that this Bouba-Kiki effect may take place from the earliest stages of life without the need of subject directly experiencing the cross-modal matching. So they don't experience cross-modal matching before this, that just happens. Similar results were obtained for other instances of cross-modal associations in this species, such as visuospatial, visuotactile, and pointing towards a predisposed general mechanism for cross-modal associations. So cross-modal associations are maybe thought to be innate, that you can build in those associations, or that they're sort of come as a natural feature selection mechanism.